And for our next little scenario, our boss would like us to create a stored procedure that allows any portion of a vendor's name to be entered and returns the number of invoices for that vendor. They would also like the ability to enter an invoice date and get a total for anything greater than the date entered. And if no date is entered, then they want the lowest invoice date in the system. So we have to have 2 input variables, and we need 1 return variable. Okay, so for our input variables, we want to allow them to enter the date and the vendor. And basically, our return variable is going to be a count of all of the vendor's invoices. So our procedure is going to be a little bit more complicated than the other ones. We've got use AP, go. And then we've got create proc, and we'll call this SP vendor invoices. We're going to specify our input variables. And the data type for the date variable is small date time. We'll set that equal to null because they don't have to fill that in. Okay? And that is an optional one. Okay? When you set a variable equal to a value, it becomes an optional input parameter. If they don't pass the parameter, the default value will be in place. And you'll notice I put a comma in there because we have 2 of them now. And then we've got vendor variable, is variable character 40, and we're setting that equal to the percentage sign. And this is a required input parameter. Even though we're setting it equal to percentage, they have to key something in. Okay? It is not the same as setting it to null. Okay? So this is required. And then we've got our as. So what we're going to be doing is checking the date variable, first of all, because that is the one they don't have to fill in. So if the date variable is null, then we're going to do a little select. Hopefully we spell it right. And we're going to set the date variable to the minimum invoice date. And that's coming from invoices. So we're basically filling it in. So if they didn't send us a date, we're filling in a date. Okay, so when we actually get to the point where we're running the select, we have a date. Then we're going to declare a variable for our little script here at invoice count, and that is an integer. And then we're going to do a select. We're going to set at invoice count equal to a count of the invoice IDs. This is all from invoices. And we're joining vendors on invoices dot vendor ID equal to vendors dot vendor ID, where the invoice date greater than or equal to our date variable, and the vendor name is like whatever they have passed as the parameter. And of course, it helps if you spell these things right. So at this point, we have the date variable filled in. So they either passed it or we set it to the minimum invoice date, which is what we needed to do. We declared invoice count. We did a little count of the invoice IDs. And we filtered that based on the date. The invoice date has to be greater than or equal to the date variable. And if they passed a vendor, which they needed to, we're also looking at that specific vendor. Okay, so we're kind of limiting what's getting counted based on our where clause. Now we said that that invoice count needed to be returned. So in stored procedures, you can return values. So we are going to return the invoice count. And then we will go ahead and say go. So this is a little busier than our previous ones because we're having to declare multiple input parameters. Plus now we have an output parameter that we are returning to the execute statement. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And we are going to move the closing comment down. And now we're going to execute this a couple different times. Okay, so we've got this set up so that we can pass it a date or we don't have to pass it a date. So you are going to want to test both ways. Okay, regardless of if we pass a date or not, it is going to return an invoice count. Okay, and we have to pass it a portion of our vendor name. So for the very first execute, I do need to create a variable that will store the data that gets returned. So I've got at invoice count and I made it an integer. So it has to be the same data type as what you declared in your script. Then I'm going to execute the stored procedure vendor invoices. I'm passing it a date. I'm passing it a portion of the vendor name. And you'll notice this is an assignment statement. Because I have a return here, it is going to return a value. So this is what is being called and executed. It's returning a value that is going to be stored here. So then if I do a select on invoice count, I can see the results. Okay, so I did select invoice count as this will be my column heading and it will have a value. And then I've run it a second time. And this time I'm still using the invoice count. I've still got the exact execute statement running vendor invoices, returning that output and storing it in invoice count. But the difference is for the date, which is the first parameter, I don't have anything in it. Okay, and the parameters are positional. So I declared date first. So you'll notice in both of these execute statements, we have date first with the comma, and then I declared the vendor variable. So that has to be second. Okay, now for this one, if you wanted to print the invoice count, remember that invoice count is an integer and the print statement can only handle character. So you have to do the little conversion on invoice count, convert it to a character so you can use to see the output in your print statement. So I'm going to go ahead and run both of these. Whoop. Try that again. So results here is from the first one. Okay, when you do a select, you see that under results. Okay, so what that's saying is there's 9 invoices that have a date greater than this one, 2/1/2010, and a vendor that begins with the letter P. The second one is going to display in messages because we use the print statement. Okay, so all this is looking at now is we have a date now that is equal to null. So what it did was it looked at the minimum invoice date and filled that in, and it looked for a date bigger than the minimum. Okay, so what it's retrieved now is a count of the invoices for the vendors that begin with the letter A, and they have a date greater than the minimum invoice date, and there was only one. So I'm going to go ahead and move the closing comment down.